Good day and welcome to Army News. Dr. Ray Wiss was a soldier who decided to change careers and became an emergency room doctor. Then, a few years ago, he returned to the military as a reserve medical officer for 2 deployments to Afghanistan. Dr. Wiss has written 2 books about his experiences on the ground there, Fob Doc and A Line in the Sand. Dr. Wiss, welcome to Army News.
Thanks for having me.
So you're a soldier who became a doctor. What did that career change involve?
Well, for me, it was a pretty big change. I was 48 years old. I was really at the top of my game, probably the best known emergency physician in Canada. And I had to take a step way back and become an ordinary medical officer in the Canadian Forces and really start as if I was starting a new career all over. But probably the biggest change for me was that I had been at a point in my career where I was finally going to be able to slow down. And instead, I took on this whole new challenge, whole new project that implied being away from my family a great deal. And of all the changes that I had to go through, that's probably the most significant.
And you have been to Afghanistan twice. What was the main difference between the first and the second time?
Well, I spent a lot longer on my second tour outside the wire, 4 months versus 2 months. But in terms of how things were, there were a number of differences. The FOBs were a lot more comfortable. One thing Canadians are known for is that we keep improving our physical surroundings, so that it was a lot more pleasant in terms of physical makeup. The environment had changed. Certainly, the nature of the war was much the same, but the politics had changed. There seemed to be a lot more at stake because we were getting closer to the time when certainly our combat involvement was going to end. And for me personally, being away longer again was more of a challenge from a family point of view, from a personal point of view. The one thing that I'm probably happiest about, though, is that I'd made a number of suggestions during my first tour, and pretty much all of them had been taken up by the Canadian Forces Health Services branch. So from a medical point of view, as well equipped as we were on my first tour, we were even better on my second. I had absolutely everything I could possibly want on my second to do my work.
And I heard the name Fob Doc. Could you explain what that term means?
Well, that was a nickname that was given to me by the soldiers on my first tour. It's very unusual for doctors to go outside the wire, to leave CAF. I, on the other hand, spent virtually all my time at the FOBs. And so somebody around the end of my first tour noticed that I had spent more time outside the wire than any other doctor since the mission began. And the name Fob Doc was created by somebody, a forward operating base doctor, and it's just stuck ever since.
And what are the challenges of doing medicine on the front line?
Well, there are the challenges you might expect. I mean, for all that we've got, it is still a minimal environment in terms of medical resources. It's not at all like working at a level 1 trauma center, like at the hospital at CAF or my hospital here and my civilian job in Canada. Obviously, there are the other differences. It's dirty, it's dangerous, it's noisy. But probably the change that, had I thought about it, would have been obvious, but didn't hit me until it actually happened, was that I'd be taking care not of anonymous patients. I'd be taking care of my fellow soldiers. And the first time that happened was at Forward Operating Base Spurwin-Gar in '07. And it was very unnerving to realize that those voices I was hearing over the radio, the people I was hearing crying out in pain, the people I knew would be coming to me in minutes, were people that I already knew very well and cared for a great deal. That was surprising, but I managed to work through it the first time, but that was a big, big difference, for sure.
So what would be the most difficult aspect of being outside the wire then?
Well, again, beyond the obvious fear that any soldier has from being outside and being exposed to that degree of risk, for myself as the doc on the FOB, as the senior medical person, you know, I just felt responsible for everybody, and I wanted so much to not make a single mistake, to make sure that I took as good care of these soldiers as possible. It's even more intense than the feeling you normally have as a doctor. Of course, you always want to do well for your patients, but that feeling was magnified tenfold when I was looking after my comrades in arms.
And the medical support for troops in Afghanistan have been unprecedented. So from your point of view, what have been the effect and the results of that?
Well, you're right. The training that our medics receive and the way they're able to implement that in the field and what we've actually brought to the Royal 3 Hospital at CAF is unbelievable. I was an infantry officer when I was much younger, and it was staggering to see how much further the medical services had evolved in the 20 years in between my 2 enlistments. And so the changes have been 2, really, and they've been at both extremes of the injury spectrum, if you will. First of all, we're much, much better at saving people's lives. I mean, people are surviving with wounds that would have left them dead even 10 years ago. And so they're surviving quite well. But that presents challenges at the other end of the spectrum because we now have challenges in rehab. We are rehabbing people with injuries that are much more severe than we've ever faced before because before these people would never have survived. So it's interesting that we're getting a benefit and a challenge out of that same enhanced medical system.
And when we look back at the combat portion of the Afghan mission, what do you think would be some of the most important medical lessons learned?
Well, one thing that we know about combat medicine now that maybe we'd almost forgotten 10 years ago, before the Afghan mission started, was that if you're not killed instantly on the battlefield, what's going to kill you is bleeding to death, hemorrhage. And we've gotten extremely good at controlling that. That might sound simple. You know, you think the blood's leaking out, just push on it, get it to stop. It's actually pretty complex. And the advances we've made in that field, again, have been amazing. And so we've learned a great deal through that. And some of that is applicable to civilian medicine. And certainly in my training of paramedics and emergency responders here in Canada, and my civilian job as a senior emergency physician, I've brought some of those lessons to bear.
Would you go back in Afghanistan?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the big challenge for me was my family and being away from my family that much. But now it's like I've got 2 families. You know, I've got my military brothers and sisters, and I've got my wife and my daughters. And if the Army were to ask me to go back to Afghanistan, I'd have to say no to one of those 2 families. And no matter who I said no to, it would be hard. And the honest answer is that I don't know.
And if you were to go back, what role would you like to play?
I would just want to be a fob doc. I was an infantry officer when I was younger, and I hadn't really thought about it until I got out there, until they put me out in the fobs. But it was the frontline soldiers, the combat arms, the engineers, the people who are out there outside the wire. Those are the people I really wanted to support. I wanted to support the mission as an individual, but the people I wanted to be with, was the people outside the wire, and there's no place else I'd want to be.
And why did you decide to write books about your Afghan experiences?
Well, as you know, I wrote 2 books, and the first one was really an accident, whereas the second one was on purpose. But they both had the same intent. They were both meant to educate. When I first went to Afghanistan, a lot of people in my circle, my medical circle, were shocked. I mean, I had this extremely successful career, and I basically put it on hold for years to go and serve in Afghanistan. And so the first book was written as a diary to try to explain to friends and family why I'd chosen to do that. And so it really was a conversation I was having with my friends, which through a series of serendipitous events became a book. The second book was written with the same idea of education in mind, but this time for Canada at large. And that's how it was from day one. I had intended to write a book not just about me, but about all of us. It really is the story of a whole combat team, and a conversation that I want to have with all Canadians to educate them about what our soldiers went through in Afghanistan, what they achieved, what they suffered, and what they lost.
You write in your books about your contact with the Afghan people. Mm-hmm. What are your overall impressions of them?
You know, I think Canadians need to understand that for the past 5 years, we've seen Afghanistan through the eyes of our combat soldiers fighting in the most backward, rural, conservative, Taliban-supporting area of the country. And even there, once you get to know the Afghans, they're just like us. You know, they want their kids to have a better life than they did. They want the simple things of a normal life. And that's in Zari Panjwai, in the worst part of the fighting, the place that has the most backwards kind of views. And if you get to meet people from elsewhere in the country, it's even more so. They're even more like us. And nothing brought that home so much to me as one night at Spurwingar on my second tour. I was watching some Afghan army officers watch TV. And what came on but the Just for Laughs gags reel, and these things are universal, absolutely universal. And I watched them laugh just as hard as any Québécois or Newfoundlander or Ontarian would. And they got the jokes, and I thought, these people are just like us. Yeah, that's the dominant impression I have of them.
There are many examples in your books of Canadian soldiers doing exceptional things. Is there anything that stand out in your memory?
Well, there are so many. It'd be difficult to pick just one, but the one that comes to mind immediately when I think about heroism is Captain Manuel Pelletier-Bédard. He was an armored officer, 12th RBC, who, when he got to Afghanistan, was recycled into an infantry officer to help out as a mentor with the Afghan army. And on one afternoon, he found himself on one side of a field with a section of his Afghan soldiers on the other side and a coming airstrike. And so he ran across that field, bullets flying all over beside him, kicking up dust beside him, to get to those soldiers and warn them of the strike, get them back to safety. And then he ran back across the same field, again, bullets flying all over the place, to call in a medevac for one of his soldiers who had been hit on the other side. And when he described this to me, he was describing it like a day at the office. And that kind of heroism just leaves me in awe.
When you were outside the wire, you carried 6 items. Could you explain me what you were carrying and why?
Well, in my right pants pocket, all the time I was outside the wire, I had 4 medallions that my mother had given to me before I left. Spiritual things, good wishes, and it always gave me comfort to feel them. The other thing I carried was 1 bullet for my pistol and 1 for my rifle. 5 days after I got to Afghanistan, our combat team found the bodies of 5 Afghan soldiers who'd been captured by the Taliban. And these people died very hard after about 24 hours of torture. And that was not an uncommon thing for us to find these bodies. And so if by some incredible stroke of bad luck, it looked like I was going to be captured, I didn't want to end like that. I wanted to have some control over how that was going to happen, how my life was going to end. We've made our mistakes in this war, but they were errors of commission. We've screwed up trying to do the right thing. History is only going to forgive one side in this war, and it will not be the side that routinely, almost exclusively, tortured its prisoners to death.
You are now an emergency physician at a Sudbury hospital. What aspect of your military experience do you apply to your civilian work?
Well, probably the biggest lesson that I've brought back, and the thing that I apply to my work, is that I'm a lot less anxious now. You're always a little bit tense as an emergency physician. You never know what's going to come through the doors. But after 2 tours in Afghanistan, there's nothing civilian life can throw at me that I'm not ready for. So I'm a lot more relaxed in my job, and I guess I just don't sweat the small stuff anymore, that's for sure. And that's a good place to be.
Anything else you would like to add?
I suppose the only thing I'd want to add is just how proud I am to wear this uniform. As a reservist, we do this really because we want to do this. It's beyond our normal job, and it's something that I will always look back on as the proudest moment of my life, not just my career, but my life, is the time I served my country, wearing this uniform in Afghanistan.
Well, thank you very much for joining us at Army News. Thanks for watching Army News. I'm Master Corporal Sébastien Saint-Jean. See you next time.